The farmhouse sat alone on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a weathered structure surrounded by 160 acres of mostly unused land. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood exposed to harsh Wisconsin winters. The windows were dark, many covered from the inside, giving the house a vacant, dead appearance even though someone lived there. The outbuildings sagged with neglect. The fields lay fallow. Everything about the property suggested abandonment, decay, a place where time had stopped and rot had set in. Inside that house, in November 1957, police would discover a scene so horrifying that even hardened investigators would be physically ill. They would find a human head in a burlap sack, a woman's torso hanging from the rafters like a butchered deer, lampshades and wastebaskets made from human skin, chairs upholstered with human flesh, a box of noses, a collection of lips, skulls used as bowls, masks made from the preserved faces of dead women, complete with hair still attached. And in a shed attached to the house, they would find the headless, gutted body of Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner who disappeared that very morning. She'd been shot, decapitated, and dressed out like a deer, hanging upside down as the blood drained from her body. The man who lived in this house of horrors was 51-year-old Ed Gein, a quiet, slight bachelor known around Plainfield as an odd but harmless handyman. People thought he was strange, yes, with his nervous laugh and his shy demeanor, and the way he seemed frozen in time. But dangerous, a killer, someone capable of unspeakable atrocities. No one suspected, no one imagined, until the day the police came, and the door to Ed Gein's private world swung open, revealing a nightmare that would shock the nation and inspire decades of horror films to come. This is the story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. This is the story of 2 murdered women and the graves of countless others that were robbed to satisfy unspeakable compulsions. This is the story of what happens when isolation, obsession, and mental illness combine in the worst possible way. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Ghoul. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. He entered a world that would offer him little joy and would shape him into something monstrous, though the process would be slow, subtle, and rooted in the very foundations of his family. His father, George Gein, was a weak, alcoholic man who worked as a tanner and carpenter when he could find work and could stay sober long enough to keep it. George was passive, ineffectual, dominated completely by his wife Augusta. He provided little financial stability and even less emotional presence in his sons' lives. To young Ed, his father was barely there at all, a shadow figure who drank and worked and disappeared into himself, offering no model of masculinity, no guidance, no protection from what was to come. His mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, was the dominant force in the household, a towering psychological presence even though she stood only 5 feet tall. Augusta was a fanatically religious woman, a Lutheran fundamentalist who believed the world was a cesspool of sin and degradation. She believed that all women except herself were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. She believed that sex was sinful, that the body was corrupt, that pleasure was evil. And she believed that her sacred duty was to raise her sons in righteousness, to protect them from the contamination of the outside world, to keep them pure. Augusta had married George out of necessity, not love. She needed financial support and he was available. She despised him for his weakness and his drinking, saw him as a fallen man, but she stayed married to him because divorce was a sin. Instead, she simply dominated him, made all decisions, controlled all money, treated him like a child who couldn't be trusted. To her sons, Ed and his older brother Henry, Augusta presented herself as the only source of truth, wisdom, and love. She read to them from the Bible every day, focusing particularly on the Old Testament passages about divine retribution, hellfire, and the wickedness of women. She emphasized the story of the temptation in Eden, how woman had brought sin into the world. She read from Revelation, painting vivid pictures of the torments awaiting sinners. She made it clear that the world outside their home was dangerous, corrupt, filled with harlots and drunkards, and people who would lead them to damnation. The family lived in La Crosse until Ed was 7 years old. George's drinking and employment problems made life there difficult, and Augusta decided they needed a fresh start somewhere she could better control her son's environment. In 1914, Augusta used money she'd saved from running a small grocery store to purchase a 160-acre farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, a tiny rural community where the population barely exceeded 600 people. The farm was isolated, exactly as Augusta wanted. The nearest neighbor was a considerable distance away. The property was accessible only by a long dirt road. Ed and Henry would have no school friends coming over to play, no neighborhood children to corrupt them with worldly ideas. They would be alone with their parents, alone with the Bible, alone with Augusta's vision of righteousness. The farmhouse itself was modest, a 2-story structure that Augusta kept immaculately clean. She designated certain rooms as off-limits, preserving them in pristine condition. These were her rooms, spaces that represented her ideals of purity and order. The boys were not allowed to enter unless invited, and such invitations were rare. The rest of the house was where the family lived, but always under Augusta's strict rules about cleanliness, behavior, and proper Christian conduct. Life on the farm was hard and isolated. George and the boys worked the land, though they were never particularly successful farmers. The soil wasn't great, George's drinking interfered with proper management, and neither Ed nor Henry had the temperament or skills for agricultural success. But Augusta insisted they work the farm because it kept them isolated, kept them from seeking employment in town, where they might be exposed to corrupting influences. Ed and Henry did attend school in Plainfield, which was unavoidable under Wisconsin law. But Augusta made sure they understood that school was dangerous, that the other children were sinful, that the teachers might fill their heads with worldly knowledge that contradicted biblical truth. She instructed them to speak to no one unless absolutely necessary, to make no friends, to come straight home after school. The other children in Plainfield thought the Gein boys were strange. Ed in particular was odd shy to the point of being nearly mute, prone to sudden inappropriate laughter, seemingly unable to make eye contact or engage in normal childhood interactions. He was small for his age, delicate, with a soft face and a nervous demeanor. The other boys sometimes bullied him, and Ed would simply take it, never fighting back, never defending himself. Augusta had taught him that violence was wrong, that he should turn the other cheek, that his reward would come in heaven. Ed had no friends. He played with no one. After school, he would hurry home to the farm to the safety of his mother's presence. She was his entire world. She was the only person who loved him, the only person who understood him, the only person who could protect him from the evil world outside. Henry, being 4 years older, had a slightly different relationship with their mother. As he grew into adolescence and young manhood, Henry began to see Augusta more clearly. He recognized that her religious fanaticism was extreme, that her control over their lives was unhealthy, that her view of the world was distorted. Henry sometimes questioned her, sometimes suggested that maybe things weren't as black and white as she made them seem. Ed never questioned her. To Ed, Augusta was infallible. She was mother, protector, teacher, the source of all truth. When she read to him from the Bible about the wickedness of women, he believed her. When she told him that sex was sin, he internalized it completely. When she said the world outside their farm was dangerous and corrupt, he accepted it as fact. As Ed grew older, this complete psychological enmeshment with his mother only deepened. While other boys his age were developing independence, dating girls, planning their futures, Ed remained utterly dependent on Augusta. He had no conception of himself as separate from her. Her opinions were his opinions. Her beliefs were his beliefs. Her needs were his needs. George Gein died on April 1, 1940, of heart failure, likely related to years of alcoholic abuse. He was 66 years old. His death barely registered as an event in the household. Augusta had long since emotionally divorced herself from him. The boys had never been close to their father. George was buried, and life on the farm continued as before, except now it was just Augusta, Henry, and Ed. Without George's meager income, money became tighter. Augusta, Henry, and Ed took on handyman work around Plainfield to make ends meet. They would do odd jobs, repairs, painting, babysitting even. Ed proved to be reasonably competent at this work when properly supervised. He was reliable, punctual, and willing to work for low wages. The people of Plainfield thought he was strange and simple-minded, but harmless enough to hire for basic tasks. Ed's reputation in Plainfield during this period was that of an oddball. People noticed his nervous laugh, the way he would giggle at inappropriate times, sometimes at things that weren't funny at all. They noticed how he seemed childlike despite being in his 30s, how he talked about his mother constantly, how he seemed to have no life apart from the farm and his work. Women sometimes found him a bit creepy, the way he would stare without seeming to realize he was doing it, the way he would linger in conversation just a bit too long. But mostly he was viewed as pathetic rather than threatening, a mama's boy, a simple man, someone to be pitied. Then, in May 1944, something happened that would change the dynamic of the Gein household forever. Ed and Henry were burning marsh vegetation on the property to clear land, a common agricultural practice. The fire got out of control, spreading more rapidly than they'd anticipated. They became separated in the smoke and confusion. When the fire department arrived and got the blaze under control, Henry was missing. Ed reported that he'd lost track of his brother in the smoke. A search party was organized. Ed led searchers directly to where Henry's body lay, face down in a clearing that the fire had barely touched. Henry was dead. The initial assumption was that Henry had died from smoke inhalation or heart failure during the frantic firefighting efforts. He was 66 years old and had been working hard in difficult conditions. But there were troubling details. Henry's body showed bruises on his head that were inconsistent with simply collapsing from smoke inhalation. And how had Ed, who claimed to have lost his brother in the smoke and confusion, been able to lead searchers directly to the body? Some people whispered that maybe Ed had killed his brother. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe Henry had said something about Augusta that Ed couldn't tolerate. Maybe Ed had struck him down and left him there. But these were just whispers, speculation. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, and no murder investigation was launched. Henry Gein was buried next to his father, and the questions about how he really died went unanswered. Whether Ed killed Henry or whether Henry's death was truly accidental, the result was the same. Now it was just Ed and Augusta, alone on the farm, bound together in an increasingly unhealthy symbiosis. Augusta was 67 years old and Ed was 37, and their isolation was complete. For the next year they lived this way. Augusta continued to read the Bible to Ed, to control every aspect of his life, to reinforce that he needed her, that the world outside was dangerous, that she was his only source of safety and love. Ed continued to worship her, to depend on her, to have no identity apart from being her son. Then in 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke. The woman who had been so strong, so dominant, so utterly in control was suddenly helpless. Ed became her caretaker, tending to her needs, watching her struggle with paralysis and speech difficulties. For a brief period, the power dynamic shifted. Ed was the caretaker and Augusta was the patient. But Augusta recovered enough to regain some mobility and speech, and the old dynamic reasserted itself. She was still the authority, still the center of Ed's universe, though now she was also fragile, mortal, vulnerable in a way she'd never been before. Then in 1946, Augusta suffered a second stroke, more severe than the first. She lingered for months, paralyzed, unable to care for herself, fatting slowly. Ed tended to her with desperate devotion, but he could not stop the inevitable. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Jane died. Ed was 49 years old, and the only person who had ever mattered to him was gone. The loss devastated him. Augusta had been his entire world, his reason for existing. Without her, he had no purpose, no identity, no sense of who he was supposed to be. He was like a planet whose sun had suddenly winked out, leaving him spinning in darkness with nothing to orbit. Ed sealed off the parts of the house that had been Augusta's: her bedroom, the parlor, the sitting room. He left them exactly as they had been the day she died, preserving them as shrines to her memory. He would not allow these rooms to be sullied or changed. They were sacred spaces, monuments to the woman who had defined his entire existence. He continued to live in the remaining rooms, but his grip on normal life began to slip. Without Augusta's structure and control, without her voice reading from the Bible and telling him what to think and how to behave, Ed began to drift. And in that drift, the obsessions that had been planted by years of psychological abuse began to grow into something dark and terrible. Part 2. The Descent into Darkness. After Augusta's death, Ed Gein's life entered a new phase, one that would lead inexorably toward the horrors that would shock the nation. But this descent was gradual, not sudden. Ed didn't immediately become a killer or a grave robber. Instead, he slowly withdrew from reality, retreating into a fantasy world where his mother still lived, where death could be overcome, where the boundaries between life and death became blurred. Ed continued to live on the farm, alone now in the decaying house. He continued to do odd jobs around Plainfield, maintaining a minimal presence in the community. People noticed that he seemed even stranger after his mother's death, more withdrawn, more prone to that nervous giggle. But he was still regarded as harmless, just a peculiar bachelor living on his dead mother's farm. But Ed's interior life was becoming increasingly disturbed. He spent hours in the sealed-off rooms that had been Augusta's, sitting in her chair, looking at her belongings, talking to her as if she were still alive. He read pulp magazines and anatomy textbooks, becoming fascinated with the human body, particularly the female body. This was forbidden knowledge, sinful knowledge, but Augusta was gone and couldn't stop him. He began to develop an obsession with death, with bodies, with the transition from living flesh to dead matter, and this obsession led him to the graveyards. Sometime in the late 1940s, the exact date is uncertain, Ed Gein began robbing graves. He would read obituaries in the local newspaper, particularly notices for middle-aged or elderly women who'd recently died. Then, late at night, he would drive to the cemetery, dig up the fresh grave, open the coffin, and examine the body. At first, he might have just looked, but eventually he began taking parts. Sometimes he would take the whole body, other times just the head or certain organs. He would bring these remains back to his farmhouse and keep them. What Ed did with these remains is almost too disturbing to describe, but it must be told to understand the full scope of his pathology. He skinned the bodies and tanned the hides, fashioning the human skin into various objects. He made masks from the faces, complete with hair, which he would wear. He made a vest from human skin that he could wear like clothing. He created leggings, a corset-like garment for the female torso. He upholstered chairs with human skin. He made lampshades, wastebaskets, even sheaths for knives from human remains. He preserved skulls, using them as bowls and decorations. He kept body parts in boxes: noses, lips, genitalia. He created what he called his mammary vest, a bizarre garment fashioned from the skin of a female torso, complete with breasts that he could wear. And he wore these things. Late at night, alone in his farmhouse, Ed would dress in these garments made from human skin. He would put on the mask of a woman's face and look at himself in the mirror. He was becoming his mother, or trying to. He was wearing women's skin because he wanted to be a woman, to become Augusta, to bring her back by literally wearing the bodies of the dead. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of Ed Gein's pathology. He wasn't simply a sadist who enjoyed mutilating bodies. He wasn't a typical necrophiliac who was sexually attracted to corpses. His relationship with these remains was about identity, about transformation, about the desperate need to reconnect with his mother by becoming her. Psychologists who later studied Ed's case would note that he exhibited what might be called extreme gender dysphoria rooted in maternal identification. He wanted to be a woman, specifically to be his mother, but he had no framework for understanding these feelings except through the distorted lens of Augusta's teachings. She had taught him that women were either virgins like her or whores like everyone else, that the female body was simultaneously sacred and sinful. Ed couldn't reconcile these contradictions, couldn't understand his own desires, so they manifested in this grotesque fashion. There's no evidence that Ed was sexually active with these remains in the conventional sense. When later examined, he showed little interest in sexual activity and claimed to be a virgin his entire life. The bodies weren't objects of sexual gratification in the traditional sense. They were objects of transformation, materials for his mad project of becoming something other than himself. How many graves did Ed rob? The exact number is unknown. When police later investigated, they found evidence connecting him to at least 15 grave robberies, but the actual number may have been higher. Ed's own accounts were unreliable and contradictory. Sometimes he claimed he didn't remember, that he would wake up in graveyards with no memory of how he got there, suffering from fugue states or blackouts. Sometimes he claimed the whole thing was exaggerated. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What's clear is that between approximately 1947 and 1954, Ed Gein regularly robbed graves in cemeteries around Plainfield and neighboring communities. He became so practiced at it that he could dig up a grave, remove the body or parts, and refill the grave in a few hours, leaving little obvious evidence of disturbance. Cemetery caretakers occasionally noticed that graves seemed disturbed, but they attributed it to settling earth or animal activity, never imagining that someone was systematically robbing the dead. The people of Plainfield remained completely unaware of what Ed was doing. During the day, he was still the odd but harmless handyman, doing odd jobs, babysitting children even, trusted enough to be allowed into people's homes. No one suspected that this shy, giggling man was spending his nights in graveyards and his private hours wearing masks made from human faces. But grave robbing, as disturbing as it was, provided Ed with a supply of bodies that were already dead. He wasn't killing anyone, just desecrating graves. This would change. At some point, the line between robbing graves and creating his own corpses would be crossed. And when it was, Plainfield would have its first murder in living memory. Part 3. The Disappearance of Mary Hogan. Mary Hogan was a 51-year-old woman who ran a tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, a small community about 6 miles from Plainfield. She'd owned the tavern for several years, having purchased it in 1952. Mary was a heavy-set woman with a reputation for being tough and independent. She lived alone in an apartment above the bar, ran the business by herself, and didn't take any nonsense from customers. The tavern was a simple establishment, the kind of small-town bar where local farmers and workers would stop for a drink after work. Mary knew most of her regular customers by name. She'd served Ed Gein before. He occasionally stopped in for a drink, though he was never a heavy drinker like his father had been. She thought he was odd but harmless, like everyone else did. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan's tavern was open for business as usual. At some point in the early afternoon, someone entered the bar. Exactly what happened next would remain unclear for years, but the evidence told a disturbing story. When customers arrived later that afternoon expecting to find Mary behind the bar, they found the place empty. The front door was unlocked. The lights were on. Mary's coat and purse were still there, suggesting she hadn't left voluntarily. And there was blood on the floor, a large pool of it, and what appeared to be a blood trail leading toward the back door. Police were called. They found a .32 caliber shell casing on the floor near the blood pool. The blood trail led outside to where tire tracks indicated a vehicle had been parked. It appeared that Mary had been shot inside her tavern, and her body had been dragged out and loaded into a vehicle. But there was no body, no suspect, no apparent motive. Mary had no known enemies. The cash register hadn't been robbed. Nothing appeared to be missing except Mary herself. It was a mystery, a deeply disturbing mystery in a small community where such violence was virtually unknown. The investigation went nowhere. Police interviewed regulars from the bar, checked for anyone with grudges against Mary, followed up on every lead they could find. But there were no witnesses, no evidence beyond the blood and the shell casing. Mary Hogan had simply vanished, presumably murdered, her body taken by whoever had killed her. The case remained unsolved. Mary Hogan was declared legally dead after the appropriate waiting period, and her tavern was eventually sold. The people of Pine Grove and Plainfield talked about the mystery for a while, then gradually moved on. Life continued, and Mary Hogan became another cold case, one of thousands of unsolved disappearances that happen across America every year. But Mary Hogan wasn't gone in the way people thought. Her body hadn't been buried in some remote location, hadn't been dumped in a lake or burned in a fire. Mary Hogan was much closer than anyone imagined. She was 6 miles away, in Ed Gein's farmhouse. Ed had killed Mary Hogan. He'd gone to her tavern that December day in 1954, waited until she was alone, shot her with a .32 caliber pistol, and dragged her body to his truck. He'd brought her back to his farm, taken her to his shed, and butchered her like a deer. He'd skinned her, removed parts he wanted, and disposed of the rest. He kept Mary Hogan's head in a burlap sack. He kept her face, preserved as a mask. He kept other parts, incorporated into his collection of human remains. And he continued living his life, doing odd jobs around Plainfield, interacting with the very people who were wondering what had happened to Mary Hogan, and no one suspected him. Why did Ed kill Mary Hogan? The transition from grave robbing to murder is significant. Grave robbing, however disturbing, involves bodies that are already dead. Murder creates the body. It crosses a line that even the most disturbed grave robber might hesitate to cross. Ed's later statements about Mary Hogan were vague and contradictory. Sometimes he claimed he didn't remember doing it, that it happened during one of his fugue states or blackouts. Sometimes he seemed to admit it but couldn't or wouldn't explain why. The most likely explanation is that Ed's need for fresh remains had begun to outweigh the availability of recently deceased women whose graves he could rob. Mary Hogan was alone, vulnerable, and available, and so Ed killed her. After Mary Hogan's murder, Ed's collection of human remains grew. He had Mary's body to work with, plus whatever graves he continued to rob. The farmhouse became increasingly filled with his macabre trophies and creations, but he kept the doors locked, the windows covered, and his secrets hidden from the outside world. For 3 years after Mary Hogan's disappearance, Ed Gein continued living his double life. Odd handyman by day, grave robber and keeper of the dead by night. The people of Plainfield continued to regard him as harmless, and he might have continued this way indefinitely, might never have been caught, except that he killed again. Part 4. The Murder of Bernice Worden. Bernice Worden was a 58-year-old widow who owned and operated Worden's hardware store in Plainfield, Wisconsin. She'd taken over the business after her husband's death and ran it competently, serving the small farming community's needs for tools, supplies, and equipment. Bernice was well liked in Plainfield, a pillar of the small community, someone everyone knew and respected. She lived alone in a house adjacent to the hardware store, though her adult son Frank Worden visited regularly. Frank was a deputy sheriff in the county, a fact that would prove crucial to solving his mother's murder. Ed Gein was a regular customer at Worden's hardware store. He would come in to buy supplies for his handyman work, to purchase antifreeze for his truck, to browse. Bernice knew Ed the way she knew all her customers, as a peculiar but regular presence in the store. On the evening of November 15, 1957, the day before the opening of deer hunting season in Wisconsin, Ed stopped by the hardware store. Frank Worden was there visiting his mother, and he witnessed Ed asking Bernice about antifreeze prices. They had a brief conversation, and Ed left, saying he'd be back the next day to purchase some. This conversation would be remembered because the next day, Bernice Worden disappeared. November 16, 1957, was the opening day of deer hunting season, a major event in rural Wisconsin. Most of the able-bodied men in Plainfield headed out into the woods early that morning, including Frank Worden. Bernice planned to keep the hardware store open for a few hours to serve any last-minute needs of hunters, then close early. When Frank returned from hunting around noon and stopped by his mother's store, he found it closed and locked, but Bernice's car was still parked outside. This was wrong. Bernice would never leave her car and walk home, especially not in the middle of the day without telling anyone. Frank entered the store using his key. The interior was dark, the lights off. Everything appeared normal except for two troubling details. There was blood on the floor, a trail of it leading toward the loading area in the back, and the cash register receipt tape showed that the last sale had been for a half-gallon of antifreeze. Antifreeze. Ed Gein had asked about antifreeze the night before, had said he'd be back to buy some. Frank Worden immediately thought of Ed. He checked the sales records and found that a half-gallon of antifreeze had been sold that morning but not paid for in cash. The money was missing from the register, suggesting whoever bought it had taken it without paying, or had paid and taken the money back. Frank Worden, operating now as a law enforcement officer rather than a son, immediately organized a search. He contacted the sheriff's department and other local police. They began checking Ed Gein's whereabouts. Where was he? Had anyone seen him that morning? Investigators found that Ed had been in town that morning, had been seen at the hardware store around the time Bernice would have been opening. They found his truck parked at a neighbor's house where Ed sometimes did work, and they decided to check his farmhouse. Sheriff Art Schley and Captain Lloyd Scoforster drove out to the Gein farm on the evening of November 16, just as darkness was falling. They'd been there before on minor matters, knew Ed as an odd but cooperative local character. They expected to ask him some questions about his whereabouts that morning, maybe eliminate him as a suspect. They found Ed not at home but returning from the house of a Plainfield couple where he'd been eating dinner. When they questioned him about his whereabouts that morning, Ed's answers were vague and nervous. He said he'd been in town but hadn't been to the hardware store, or maybe he had. He couldn't remember clearly. His nervous giggle punctuated his answers, making him seem evasive. The officers asked if they could search his property. Ed agreed, though his agreement may have been more compliance than consent. As they approached the farmhouse in the gathering darkness, they noticed the windows were covered from the inside, the property cluttered with junk and abandoned equipment. They entered through the summer kitchen, a kind of enclosed porch area used for messy tasks. Sheriff Schley had a flashlight, and he swung it around the dark space. The beam illuminated something hanging from the rafters. At first, in the darkness, it looked like a deer carcass hanging to drain, which would have been perfectly normal during hunting season. But as Schley's flashlight beam steadied on the object, he realized with dawning horror that it wasn't a deer. It was a human body, a woman's body, headless and gutted, hanging upside down by the ankles from a wooden crossbeam. The body had been opened from sternum to pelvis, the internal organs removed, dressed out exactly like a hunter would dress a deer. The sight was so shocking, so utterly unexpected, that for a moment the officers couldn't process what they were seeing. Then they understood. This was Bernice Worden. This was what had happened to her. Ed Gein had killed her, brought her body here, and butchered her. Sheriff Schley, a hardened law enforcement officer who'd served in World War II, was physically sickened. He stumbled out of the shed and vomited. Captain Schofister stood frozen, his mind unable to accept what his eyes were seeing. They immediately arrested Ed Gein, handcuffing him and placing him in the patrol car. Ed didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved, as if part of him wanted this to be over. As they drove him away from the farm, he asked what would happen to his property. He seemed more concerned about this than about being arrested for murder. More officers arrived at the farm. They secured the scene and prepared to conduct a thorough search. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover inside the farmhouse itself. Part 5. The House of Horrors. As law enforcement officers entered Ed Gein's farmhouse on that November night in 1957, they carried flashlights and a sense of dread about what they might find. The discovery of Bernice Worden's butchered corpse had already shaken these men, but what they found inside the house would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The farmhouse was cluttered, filthy, filled with garbage and debris. Piles of newspapers and magazines covered surfaces. Dirty dishes were stacked in the kitchen. The smell was overwhelming rot decay, something worse than ordinary neglect. The officers moved through the rooms carefully, their flashlights revealing horror after horror. In the kitchen, they found a shoebox containing noses. Human noses, just sitting in a box like someone might store buttons or receipts. They found a collection of lips in another container. They found a human heart in a plastic bag on the stove. The officers couldn't tell if Ed had been planning to cook it or had just placed it there. They found skulls, multiple skulls. Some had been cut and fashioned into bowls or cups. Skull caps had been removed to create what appeared to be soup bowls. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate. These weren't just discarded remains. They were objects Ed had created for use. They found lampshades made from human skin. The skin had been carefully removed, tanned, and stretched over wire frames. The texture was unmistakable. Human skin has a different appearance than animal hide, and these experienced rural officers recognized it immediately. They found chairs upholstered with human skin. The seats and backs had been covered with tanned human flesh, complete with nipples still visible on some pieces. They found a wastebasket made from human skin. They found a shoebox containing vulvae, 9 female genitalia, that had been preserved. They found a corset or vest made from the tanned skin of a female torso, complete with breasts. This was the mammary vest that Ed had apparently worn, trying to transform himself into a woman by literally wearing female skin. They found faces, multiple human faces that had been carefully removed from skulls, preserved with the hair still attached, fashioned into masks that could be worn. The preservation was crude but effective. The faces were recognizable as human, with empty eye sockets and slack mouths creating expressions of death. They found a head in a burlap sack. When they opened it, they discovered Mary Hogan's head, missing for 3 years, her face preserved in death. They found Bernice Worden's head in another bag. Ed had shot her, decapitated her, and kept her head as a trophy. They found leggings made from human skin, actual pants fashioned from the skin of human legs. They found knife sheaths made from human flesh. They found a drawer full of female genitalia that Ed had carved from corpses and preserved. They found skin rolled up and stored, like someone might store fabric for future projects. And everywhere, throughout the house, there were bones. Human bones mixed in with garbage and debris, scattered like someone had simply discarded them when the flesh had been removed. The officers who conducted this search were tough men, farmers and war veterans who'd seen death and violence. But this was different. This wasn't death in the normal sense, not even violent death. This was desecration, transformation, a grotesque artistry that took human remains and turned them into objects of utility and decoration. One officer had to leave the house and sit in his car, unable to continue. Another was physically ill multiple times during the search. They'd never imagined that such horrors existed, that a human being could do these things, that in their small community of Plainfield, Wisconsin, this house of terrors had existed for years without anyone knowing. The sealed-off rooms, Augusta's bedroom. Her parlor were found pristine, exactly as she'd left them years before. These rooms stood in stark contrast to the rest of the house. While the rooms Ed lived in were filled with filth and human remains, Augusta's rooms were clean, orderly, sacred spaces where Ed had preserved her memory. The dichotomy was striking. The mother's rooms were shrines to purity, while the son's rooms were charnel houses. As the search continued through the night and into the next day, investigators began cataloging everything they found. The inventory would eventually include remains from at least 15 different bodies, though the exact number was difficult to determine because bodies had been dismembered and parts had been mixed together. Crime scene photographers documented everything. The photographs that survive are among the most disturbing crime scene images ever taken. Even hardened homicide investigators who later viewed these photos were shocked by their content. The images showed clearly that Ed had created an entire environment out of human remains, had surrounded himself with death, had literally worn the dead like clothing. Investigators also found Ed's reading material pulp magazines about Nazis and their atrocities, anatomy textbooks, stories about trans-Pacific headhunters. These provided some insight into Ed's thinking, the influences that had shaped his grotesque practices. But they also raised questions. Were these reading materials the cause of his behavior or the result of it? Did he read about these things and then emulate them? Or was he drawn to this material because it resonated with desires already present? The community of Plainfield was in shock. News spread quickly through the small town that Ed Gein had been arrested, that Bernice Worden's body had been found, that unimaginable horrors had been discovered in his farmhouse. People couldn't believe it. Ed Gein, that harmless, odd man who'd babysat their children, who'd done handyman work in their homes, who'd been part of the community for decades. But the evidence was undeniable. Ed Gein was not harmless. Ed Gein was a killer and a grave robber and something else, something worse, something for which there wasn't even a proper name. Part 6. The Confession. Ed Gein was held in the Waushara County Jail in Wautoma, Wisconsin, while investigators tried to make sense of what they'd found. He was questioned extensively by local police, state investigators, and eventually by specialists in abnormal psychology. Ed was cooperative during questioning, almost eager to talk. He spoke in his usual soft voice, punctuated by that nervous giggle that had always made people uncomfortable. But now that giggle took on a sinister quality, as if he were laughing at some private joke the rest of the world couldn't understand. He readily admitted to killing Bernice Worden. He described going to her hardware store on the morning of November 16, waiting until she was alone, shooting her in the head with a .22 caliber rifle he'd brought with him, then loading her body into his truck and bringing it back to his farm. He described hanging her body in the shed and dressing her out like a deer, removing her head and internal organs. He spoke about these acts matter-of-factly, as if describing any ordinary task like butchering livestock. When questioned about Mary Hogan, Ed initially denied involvement, but when confronted with the fact that her head had been found in his house, he eventually admitted to killing her as well. He described going to her tavern in December 1954, shooting her and taking her body. His memory of the event was hazy, he claimed, as if it had happened in a dream or during one of his blackout periods. When asked about the other human remains in his house, Ead's story became more complicated. He admitted to grave robbing, describing in detail how he would read obituaries, select female victims, always women who reminded him of his mother in some way, and then dig up their graves at night. He claimed to have robbed dozens of graves over the years, though he couldn't remember exactly how many. But Ed insisted that most of the bodies came from graves, not from murders. He claimed that besides Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he hadn't killed anyone else. The police were skeptical of this claim. They had remains from at least 15 different bodies in his house. 2 were identified as Hogan and Worden. That left 13 others. Had Ed killed 13 more women? Were there victims no one even knew were missing? Investigators cross-referenced Ed's possible grave robbery victims with death records and found that in many cases, the graves Ed claimed to have robbed did correspond to real deaths of middle-aged or elderly women in the area. Some of these graves were exhumed, and in several cases, the coffins were found to be empty or disturbed, lending credence to Ed's claims about grave robbing. However, some remains in Ed's house couldn't be accounted for through documented deaths and grave robberies. There may have been more murder victims, but definitive proof was impossible to establish. Bodies had been so thoroughly dismembered and mixed together that individual identification was difficult, and Ed's memory, or his willingness to share it, was unreliable. When asked why he had done these things, Ed's explanations were confused and contradictory. Sometimes he said he didn't know, that he would find himself in graveyards or standing over bodies with no memory of how he got there. Sometimes he claimed he'd been planning to create a woman's suit that he could wear to become a woman, to become his mother. Sometimes he said he just wanted to study anatomy, to understand the human body. Psychologists who evaluated Ed in the weeks and months after his arrest found a deeply disturbed individual whose psyche had been warped by years of maternal domination and isolation. Dr. Edward Schubert, who conducted extensive interviews with Ed, concluded that he suffered from what would now be called schizophrenia with possible psychotic episodes, though diagnoses in 1957 were less precise than modern psychiatric evaluations. Ed showed signs of gender identity confusion, telling doctors that he had sometimes wondered what it would be like to be a woman, had fantasized about having female anatomy, had created the woman's suit and other items as a way to explore these feelings. But these weren't the feelings of a transgender person seeking gender affirmation through legitimate means. These were the distorted expressions of someone whose understanding of gender, sexuality, and the human body had been warped beyond recognition by abuse and isolation. Ed also showed signs of maternal fixation that went far beyond normal grief for a deceased parent. He spoke about his mother constantly, describing her as a saint, as the only good woman who ever lived, as someone whose death had left him utterly alone in a world of sin and corruption. He seemed unable to conceptualize her as truly dead, speaking about her sometimes in the present tense, as if she might walk into the room at any moment. The doctors concluded that Ed was not faking his mental illness. His beliefs and perceptions were genuinely delusional. He inhabited a reality that was fundamentally different from that of normal people. Questions about right and wrong, about the sanctity of human remains, about normal social boundaries, these concepts seemed to have no meaning for Ed, or had meaning so distorted that they were unrecognizable. But was he competent to stand trial? This became the central legal question. If Ed was so mentally ill that he couldn't understand the charges against him or assist in his own defense, then he couldn't be tried for murder. He would instead be committed to a mental institution indefinitely. Part 7. The Trial Question. The legal proceedings surrounding Ed Gein would become complicated and drawn out, focused not on whether he had killed Bernice Worden, he'd confessed, and the evidence was overwhelming, but on whether he was mentally competent to stand trial for the crime. In January 1958, just 2 months after his arrest, Ed was committed to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin, for psychiatric evaluation. This was a facility for the criminally insane, where he would be examined by mental health professionals to determine his competency. The doctors at Central State Hospital conducted extensive evaluations. They interviewed Ed, observed his behavior, administered tests, and compiled detailed reports on his mental state. Their conclusions were unanimous. Ed Gein was severely mentally ill and was not competent to stand trial. The psychiatric reports described Ed as suffering from schizophrenia, with delusions and possible hallucinations. He showed signs of psychosis, an inability to distinguish clearly between reality and fantasy. He had created an elaborate fantasy world in which his mother was still alive, in which wearing women's skin made sense, in which the dead could be transformed and preserved. Based on these evaluations, Judge Herbert A. Bund ruled in January 1958 that Ed Gein was not competent to stand trial and ordered him committed to Central State Hospital indefinitely. This meant Ed would not face trial for murder at that time. Instead, he would be held in the psychiatric facility until and unless doctors determined that he had become competent. This decision frustrated some people who wanted to see Ed face a murder trial and possible execution. Wisconsin had capital punishment on the books at that time, though it was rarely used. Some felt that Ed deserved to die for his crimes, that being committed to a hospital was too lenient. But others understood that Ed's mental illness was genuine and severe. Trying someone who cannot understand the charges against them, who cannot assist their attorney in mounting a defense, who cannot participate meaningfully in their own trial, violates basic principles of justice. If Ed was truly incompetent, then commitment to a mental hospital was the only appropriate option. Ed remained at Central State Hospital for the next 10 years, from 1958 to 1968. During this time, he received psychiatric treatment, though the effectiveness of mental health treatment in the 1950s and 60s was limited compared to modern standards. He was kept in a secure facility, prevented from harming himself or others, but there was no realistic hope of curing him or returning him to normal functioning. During his years at Central State Hospital, Ed was described by staff as a model patient. He was polite, cooperative, generally passive. He helped with janitorial duties, worked in the hospital grounds keeping gardens, and caused no trouble. His notorious nervous giggle was still present, but he seemed content enough in his institutionalized routine. He had few visitors. He had no close friends or family left. His brother Henry was dead. His parents were dead. The people of Plainfield wanted nothing to do with him. He was alone, as he had been most of his life, but now his isolation was enforced by institutional walls rather than by choice. Meanwhile, back in Plainfield, the community was trying to move on from the horror that had occurred in their midst. The Gein farmhouse had become a macabre tourist attraction, with gawkers driving out to see where the horrors had taken place. The property owner eventually had enough and arranged for the farmhouse to be burned down in March 1958. A large crowd gathered to watch it burn, treating it like a community exorcism, destroying the physical structure where such terrible things had happened. The site where the house had stood was eventually cleared, and the property passed through various owners. Today, nothing remains of the original Gein farmhouse. The land where it stood is privately owned, and there are no markers or monuments indicating what once occurred there. In 1968, 10 years after his initial commitment, Ed's mental state was reevaluated. Doctors concluded that while he was still severely mentally ill, He had improved to the point where he could understand the charges against him and could assist in his defense. In other words, he was now competent to stand trial. This raised a new question. Should he be tried? Ed was now 62 years old. He'd been institutionalized for a decade. He was no threat to anyone. What would be gained by putting him on trial for a murder committed 11 years earlier? But the decision was made to proceed with the trial. The families of the victims deserved their day in court. The legal system needed to resolve the question of Ed's guilt or innocence in a proper judicial proceeding. And there was still the possibility of criminal punishment, even if Ed would likely be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial was set for November 1968, exactly 11 years after Bernice Worden's murder. Part 8. The Trial. The trial of Ed Gein for the first-degree murder of Bernice Worden began on November 7, 1968, in Washoe County Circuit Court. The venue had been moved from Waupun County due to extensive pretrial publicity that made finding an impartial jury there impossible. Everyone in Plainfield and the surrounding area knew about Ed Gein, had opinions about him, couldn't possibly be impartial jurors. Judge Robert H. Gallmer presided over the trial. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Earl Killeen. The defense was handled by court-appointed attorney William Belter, who faced the challenging task of defending a man who had confessed to murder and whose crimes were documented in horrific detail. The defense strategy was clear from the beginning: not guilty by reason of insanity. Belter would not contest that Ed had killed Bernice Worden. The evidence was overwhelming, and Ed had confessed. Instead, the defense would argue that Ed was so mentally ill at the time of the murder that he could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. The trial lasted only 1 week, remarkably short for such a notorious case. The prosecution presented its evidence efficiently. They called Frank Worden to testify about finding his mother's store empty and blood-stained, about the missing antifreeze and the sales receipt. They called the law enforcement officers who had discovered Bernice's body in Ed's shed and the horrific remains inside his house. They presented photographs, though the judge limited which photos could be shown to the jury due to their extremely graphic nature. They established that Ed had killed Bernice Worden, that he had done so deliberately by shooting her in the head, that he had taken her body to his farm, and that he had mutilated it in the manner consistent with the other remains found in his house. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Ed Gein had committed first-degree murder, and he should be convicted. The defense did not dispute these facts. Instead, they called psychiatric experts to testify about Ed's mental state. Dr. Edward Schubert, who had evaluated Ed extensively after his arrest, testified that Ed was severely mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia and psychosis, and that he had been in this state at the time of Bernice Worden's murder. Other psychiatrists testified similarly. They described Ed's delusional thinking, his inability to distinguish right from wrong in any meaningful way, his distorted understanding of reality. They explained how years of abuse and isolation under Augusta's control had damaged his psyche beyond repair. They described his bizarre behaviors, the grave robbing, the creation of objects from human skin, the wearing of dead women's faces, as symptoms of severe mental illness rather than the actions of a criminally responsible person. The defense argued that Ed couldn't be held legally responsible for murder because he lacked the mental capacity to form criminal intent. He was operating in a delusional state where normal moral and legal rules didn't apply. He was, in essence, so crazy that he couldn't be guilty of murder in the legal sense, even though he had factually killed someone. The prosecution countered that mental illness doesn't automatically equal legal insanity. They argued that Ed knew what he was doing when he brought a rifle to Bernice's store, when he shot her, when he took her body and hid it. These were planned, purposeful actions that demonstrated awareness and intent. The fact that he was mentally ill didn't mean he couldn't form criminal intent. The jury heard all the evidence and arguments over the course of the week. They saw photographs of Ed's house of horrors, though not the most graphic ones. They heard testimony about the grave robberies, the skin suits, the preserved heads. They listened to psychiatric experts debate whether Ed's mental illness rose to the level of legal insanity. On November 14, 1968, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just one day. On November 15, they returned with their verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict meant that Ed was not criminally responsible for Bernice Worden's murder. He would not be sentenced to prison. Instead, he would be returned to Central State Hospital, where he would remain indefinitely as a patient rather than a prisoner. Judge Gallmer accepted the jury's verdict and ordered Ed committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Ed would spend the rest of his life in institutional care, never to be released, but also never to be punished in the traditional criminal justice sense. The verdict was controversial. Some people felt that justice had been served, Ed was clearly insane, and punishing him criminally would have been pointless. Others felt that he'd gotten away with murder, that he should have been executed or at least imprisoned for life, regardless of his mental state. But legally, the matter was settled. Ed Gein would not stand trial for any other crimes. The state could have prosecuted him for Mary Hogan's murder, for grave robbing, for mutilation of corpses. But there seemed little point. He was already committed indefinitely to a mental institution. Additional convictions would change nothing. And so Ed Gein's legal case ended, not with execution or a dramatic prison sentence, but with a quiet commitment to a hospital where he would spend his remaining years. Part 9. Life in the Asylum. Ed Gein spent the last 16 years of his life at Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin, later transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. His life in these institutions was quiet, routine, and utterly removed from the outside world that had been so horrified by his crimes. By all accounts, Ed was a model patient. He was cooperative with staff, took his medications when prescribed, participated in therapeutic activities when asked. He maintained his role as a helper, doing janitorial work, tending to gardens, performing small tasks that gave him purpose and structure. He was housed in a secure unit for the criminally insane, meaning he had no freedom of movement and was constantly supervised. But within those constraints, he had a relatively peaceful existence. He had a private room, access to books and magazines, though presumably not the pulp horror and anatomy magazines he'd favored before, and regular meals. Staff members who worked with Ed during this period described him as polite, quiet, even pleasant in interactions. He would talk about gardening, about the weather, about mundane topics. He rarely mentioned his crimes, rarely talked about his mother, seemed to exist in a kind of perpetual present where the past was sealed off and the future didn't exist. But he never showed true remorse for what he'd done. When asked about his crimes, he would sometimes claim not to remember, sometimes speak about them in a detached way as if describing things someone else had done. He seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the enormity of his actions, the suffering he'd caused to his victims and their families. Psychologists continued to evaluate him periodically, and their assessments remained consistent. Ed was severely mentally ill, posed a danger if released, and would require institutional care for the rest of his life. There was no realistic possibility of rehabilitation or release. Ed had occasional visitors over the years, though not many. A few curiosity seekers tried to visit, people fascinated by his notoriety, but the hospital turned most of these away. Journalists occasionally requested interviews, which Ed sometimes granted and sometimes refused depending on his mood and the hospital staff's recommendations. In 1974, Author Harold Schechter interviewed Ed extensively for his book on the case. Ed was willing to talk, even seemed to enjoy the attention. He spoke about his childhood, his mother, the isolated farm, but he remained vague and evasive about the murders and grave robberies, still claiming memory lapses and confusion about what had really happened. As Ed aged, his physical health declined. He developed cancer in 1984, and despite treatment, it progressed. He was 77 years old, had been institutionalized for over a quarter century, and his body was failing. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure caused by cancer at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He was 77 years old. He died in a hospital bed, attended by medical staff, having spent the last 26 years of his life in institutional care. His death was noted in newspapers across the country. Ed Gein, inspiration for Psycho, dies, was a typical headline. Even in death, Ed was defined by his crimes and by the cultural impact they'd had. Ed's body was returned to Plainfield for burial. There was no funeral service, no gathering of mourners. Who would have attended? He had no family left, no friends, no one who mourned his passing. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in the same cemetery where some of the graves he'd robbed were located, next to his mother Augusta. Even this final rest was not peaceful. Ed's gravestone became a target for vandals and souvenir hunters. People would chip pieces off the stone, steal it entirely, treat it as a macabre collectible. The stone had to be replaced multiple times. Eventually, it was removed entirely to prevent further vandalism, and today Ed's grave is unmarked, its exact location known only to cemetery officials. And so Ed Gein passed into history, leaving behind a legacy of horror that would outlive him by decades. Part 10. The VICTIMS REMBRED. In all the fascination with Ed Gein's crimes, in all the analysis of his psychology and the cultural impact of his case, it's crucial to remember the victims, the women whose lives he ended and whose remains he desecrated. Bernice Worden was 58 years old when Ed Gein shot her in her hardware store on November 16, 1957. She was a widow, a businesswoman, a mother to Frank Worden and other children. She'd built a life in Plainfield, had been part of the community for decades, was known and liked by virtually everyone. Bernice was described by those who knew her as capable, independent, and friendly. She'd taken over the hardware store after her husband's death and run it successfully, serving the needs of the farming community. She was someone people relied on, someone who filled a vital role in the small town's economy and social fabric. On that November morning, Bernice opened her store as usual, expecting a quiet day since most people were out deer hunting. She probably wasn't worried when Ed Gein walked in. He was a regular customer, someone she'd served many times before. She had no reason to fear him, no way of knowing what he was planning. Ed shot her in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The death was likely instantaneous. Bernice probably never knew what hit her. This is a small mercy in a story with few mercies. She didn't suffer prolonged torture, wasn't terrorized or tormented. But she died suddenly, violently, at the hands of someone she'd trusted enough to allow into her store. Her son Frank found her missing, discovered the blood, led the investigation that resulted in Ed's arrest. Frank had to live with the knowledge of what had been done to his mother's body, had to testify at the trial, had to carry the burden of those horrific discoveries for the rest of his life. The trauma extended beyond Bernice herself to everyone who loved her. Mary Hogan was 51 when Ed killed her in December 1954. She'd been running her tavern in Pine Grove for 2 years, had built a small business serving local workers and farmers. Mary was known as a tough, independent woman who could handle herself in the rough environment of a rural bar. But when Ed came into her tavern that December day, her toughness couldn't save her. He shot her, just as he would later shoot Bernice Worden, and took her body to his farm. Mary's remains were found 3 years later in Ed's house, her head preserved, her body parts incorporated into his grotesque collection. Mary had no children to search for her, no Frank Worden to drive the investigation. She disappeared, and for 3 years no one knew what had happened to her. The case went cold. People speculated but had no answers. It wasn't until Ed's arrest in 1957 that the truth came out, that Mary's fate became known. Both Mary and Bernice deserved better than the deaths they received. They deserved to live out their lives naturally, to die peacefully in old age surrounded by people who loved them. Instead, they encountered Ed Gein on the wrong day, became targets of his disturbed compulsions, and paid with their lives. But there were other victims too, though they were already dead when Ed violated them. The women whose graves he robbed, whose bodies he stole and dismembered and fashioned into objects, they too deserve to be remembered and respected. Based on the remains found in Ed's house and subsequent investigations, at least 15 different bodies contributed to his collection. Some of these were identified through matching remains to known deaths and disturbed graves. Others remain unknown body parts that couldn't be matched to any specific person. These women had lived lives, had families who loved them, had died natural deaths and been laid to rest with dignity and respect. Their families had mourned them, buried them, believed they were at peace. The discovery that their graves had been robbed, that their remains had been stolen and desecrated, added a horrific new layer of grief to losses they thought they'd already processed. Some families chose to exhume and rebury their loved ones in secret locations to prevent further disturbance. Others tried to pretend the grave robbery hadn't happened, tried to maintain the fiction that their loved ones still rested peacefully. The violation was so extreme, so disturbing, that there was no good way to cope with it. The psychological impact on the families of both murder victims and grave robbery victims cannot be overstated. Imagine learning that your mother's or wife's or daughter's body had been dug up, skinned, and turned into furniture and clothing. Imagine having to testify at a trial where photographs of these desecrations might be shown. Imagine living in a small community where everyone knows what happened, where your family's trauma is public knowledge. Some families left Plainfield after Ed's crimes came to light, unable to bear living in the community where such horrors had occurred. Others stayed but carried the burden of grief and shame that wasn't theirs to bear but that attached itself anyway, the way trauma often does. In remembering Ed Gein's case, we must center these victims. Not Ed's psychology, not the horror film inspiration, not the macabre fascination with his crimes. The victims, the women who died or whose remains were violated, the families who suffered, the community that was traumatized. Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan were human beings with value, with lives that mattered, with people who loved them. The women whose graves were robbed had been respected members of their community, had earned peaceful rest, had deserved to remain undisturbed in death. Ed Gein took all of that away from them. His crimes didn't just end 2 lives and violate numerous corpses. They created ripples of trauma that spread through families and community, ripples that continued for decades after the crimes themselves. Part 11. Cultural Impact and the Birth of Horror. The case of Ed Gein had an immediate and lasting impact on American culture that extends far beyond the small community of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The details of his crimes were so shocking, so unprecedented, that they captured the national imagination and became source material for some of the most iconic horror stories of the 20th century. The first and most famous work inspired by Ed Gein was Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, published in 1959, just 2 years after Ed's arrest. Bloch lived in Wisconsin and had followed the Gein case closely in the newspapers. He was fascinated by the idea of a seemingly normal person hiding monstrous secrets, of a mama's boy whose devotion to his mother had curdled into something terrible. Psycho tells the story of Norman Bates, a motel owner who lives with his domineering mother. But Norman's mother is actually dead, preserved in the fruit cellar, and Norman has taken on her personality, dressing in her clothes and killing people while believing himself to be her. The parallels to Ed Gein are obvious: the isolated rural location, the dead mother, the confusion of identity, the murders. When Alfred Hitchcock adapted Psycho into a film in 1960, it became one of the most influential horror films ever made. The shower scene, the reveal of Mother's preserved corpse, Norman's split personality, these became iconic moments in cinema history. And at the root of it all was Ed Gein's real-life horror. The connection between Norman Bates and Ed Gein is sometimes overstated. Norman is a fictional character with his own specific pathology that differs from Ed's in important ways. But the inspiration is undeniable. Without Ed Gein, Psycho, as we know it, might never have existed. In 1974, Tobe Hooper directed the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, a low-budget horror film that would become another genre-defining classic. The film features Leatherface, a killer who wears masks made from human skin and lives in a farmhouse decorated with furniture made from human bones. He and his cannibalistic family kill travelers and turn their bodies into meat and decorations. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre is not a biographical film about Ed Gein. It's set in Texas, involves multiple killers, includes cannibalism that Ed never practiced. But the core imagery of skin masks and bone furniture comes directly from the discoveries made in Ed's farmhouse. Hooper was explicit about Ed Gein being an inspiration for the film. In 1991, The Silence of the Lambs introduced James Gumb, nicknamed Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who murders overweight women and skins them to create a woman suit he can wear. Buffalo Bill wants to be a woman and believes that wearing female skin will transform him. He keeps his victims in a pit, kills them, and skins them with methodical precision. Buffalo Bill is directly based on Ed Gein's practices. The woman suit made from real skin, the identity confusion, the methodical treatment of bodies. These are all elements taken from Ed's case. Thomas Harris, the author of the novel, combined elements from Ed Gein with other serial killers to create Buffalo Bill, but Ed's influence is the most obvious. These three works, Psycho, The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs, are among the most influential horror films ever made. They've spawned countless imitators, influenced entire subgenres of horror, and become part of the cultural vocabulary. And all three trace their origins, at least in part, back to Ed Gein. Beyond these specific works, Ed Gein influenced the entire concept of the small-town horror narrative. Before Ed, horror stories typically involved monsters from outside, vampires from Transylvania, creatures from outer space, atomic mutations. But Ed showed that real horror could exist in the most mundane, all-American setting: a rural farming community, a farmhouse that looked like thousands of others, a quiet man who seemed harmless. This realization, that monsters could be your neighbors, that horror could exist hidden in plain sight, fundamentally changed how Americans thought about safety and normalcy. The post-Ed Gein horror genre is filled with stories about seemingly normal people harboring terrible secrets, about small towns with dark histories, about the monster next door. Ed also became a fixture in true crime culture. Books have been written about his case, documentaries filmed, podcasts produced. He appears in lists of the most notorious serial killers, though technically he only killed 2 people. His notoriety comes not from the number of his victims but from the nature of his crimes. The fascination with Ed Gein raises uncomfortable questions about our culture. Why are we so drawn to stories about him? What does it say about us that we've turned his horrific crimes into entertainment? Are we honoring the victim's memories or exploiting their suffering? There's no easy answer to these questions. True crime can serve educational purposes, can help us understand the nature of evil and mental illness, can satisfy legitimate curiosity about the darker aspects of human nature. But it can also become voyeuristic, sensationalistic, disrespectful to victims and their families. In Ed Gein's case, the line is particularly difficult to navigate because his crimes were so extreme and bizarre that they almost seem fictional. It's hard to believe that someone really did these things, really created lampshades from human skin, really wore dead women's faces as masks. The grotesque creativity of his crimes makes them fascinating in a way that more straightforward murders are not. But we must remember that behind the horror movie imagery, behind the cultural impact, there were real victims. Bernice Worden was a real woman who died horribly. Mary Hogan was a real woman who disappeared and was mutilated. The women whose graves were robbed were real people whose final rest was violated. When we watch Psycho or the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, when we read about Ed Gein or listen to podcasts about his crimes, we should do so with this awareness. Entertainment and education must be balanced with respect and remembrance. Part 12. Psychological Analysis. Understanding Ed Gein requires grappling with some of the most extreme psychological pathology ever documented. His case has been studied by psychiatrists, psychologists, and criminologists for decades, and while there's consensus on some aspects of his mental illness, other elements remain debated and mysterious. The foundation of Ed's pathology was clearly his relationship with his mother Augusta. This relationship was characterized by what psychologists call enmeshment, a pathological blurring of boundaries between parent and child, where the child cannot develop a separate identity. But Ed's enmeshment with Augusta went far beyond even extreme cases typically seen in clinical practice. Augusta didn't just dominate Ed, she became his entire reality. She controlled what he thought, believed, and felt. She isolated him from alternative viewpoints or influences. She taught him that the world outside their farm was sinful and dangerous, that women except her were whores, that his body and its urges were evil. And Ed, having no other frame of reference, accepted all of this as absolute truth. When Augusta died, Ed didn't just lose a mother. He lost the organizing principle of his entire existence. He'd never developed an independent identity, had never learned to think for himself, had never formed relationships with anyone else. Without Augusta, he was like a planet whose sun had suddenly disappeared, still in motion but no longer orbiting anything, drifting in darkness. The grave robbing and later murders can be understood as desperate attempts to bring Augusta back, to recreate her, to become her. By wearing women's skin, Ed was literally trying to wear his mother, to merge with her physically in a way that he'd already merged with her psychologically. This is where gender identity enters the picture in a complex and disturbing way. Ed showed signs of what we might now call gender dysphoria, a disconnect between his assigned male gender and an internal sense of being or wanting to be female. But this wasn't gender dysphoria in the sense that transgender individuals experience it. Ed's desire to be female was inextricably bound up with his desire to be his mother specifically, not to be a woman in general. He created the woman suit from human skin because he believed that literally wearing female anatomy would transform him. This is magical thinking, a sign of psychosis. Healthy transgender individuals understand that gender identity is psychological and that physical transition, when pursued, happens through medical means. Ed's approach was grotesque and delusional, reflecting his profound mental illness. Ed also showed signs of what's now called necrophilia, though again, his relationship with corpses was unusual even by the standards of this paraphilia. Most necrophiles are sexually attracted to corpses and engage in sexual acts with them. Ed seemed to have little conventional sexual interest at all. His interaction with corpses was about possession, transformation, and connection rather than sexual gratification. The schizophrenia diagnosis that Ed received in the 1950s and 60s was probably accurate, though modern psychiatry might refine it with more specific terminology. He showed signs of psychotic breaks from reality, delusional thinking, and severely disorganized thought processes. The fugue states or blackouts he claimed to experience during grave robberies might have been genuine dissociative episodes, or they might have been convenient excuses to avoid full responsibility for his actions. We'll never know for certain. What's particularly disturbing about Ed's case from a psychiatric perspective is how he functioned in daily life despite his severe mental illness. He held jobs, interacted with community members, maintained enough of a normal facade that people found him odd but not dangerous. This high-level functioning alongside extreme pathology is rare and suggests someone who'd learned to compartmentalize his delusional world from his public persona. During the day, Ed could be the harmless handyman, the polite customer, the reliable worker. But at night, alone on his farm or in graveyards, he entered a completely different psychological state where normal rules didn't apply, where desecrating corpses made sense, where wearing dead women's skin seemed reasonable. This compartmentalization may have been a survival mechanism developed during childhood. Ed learned early that he had to present a certain face to the world, the obedient son, the quiet student, while hiding his true thoughts and feelings. This skill, developed to cope with Augusta's domination, later enabled him to hide much darker secrets. From a criminological perspective, Ed Gein doesn't fit neatly into typical serial killer categories. He only definitely killed 2 people, which technically doesn't meet the FBI's definition of a serial killer, 3 or more victims. His motivation wasn't sexual gratification in the conventional sense, wasn't about power and control in the way that most serial killers operate, wasn't about rage or revenge. Instead, Ed's crimes seem to have been motivated by a desperate need to overcome death, to preserve and possess the dead, to transform himself through grotesque means. He was less a serial killer than a grave robber who occasionally killed to supplement his supply of bodies. This distinction matters because it affects how we understand and prevent such crimes. If Ed had been a typical serial killer driven by sadistic urges, then understanding his pathology might help identify similar individuals before they kill. But Ed's specific combination of factors, the extreme maternal enmeshment, the isolated rural upbringing, the religious fanaticism, the gender identity confusion, the psychosis is so unusual that it's unlikely to be repeated exactly. We can learn from Ed's case that extreme childhood abuse and isolation can create monsters. We can learn that mental illness, when untreated and combined with access to vulnerable victims, can lead to terrible crimes. We can learn that seemingly harmless, odd people can harbor horrific secrets. But we can't create a profile that would have identified Ed Gein before he killed, because his particular pathology was too unique. Part 13. The Aftermath in Plainfield. The small community of Plainfield, Wisconsin, was forever changed by the discovery of Ed Gein's crimes. A town of barely 600 people found itself thrust into the national spotlight, associated forever with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. In the immediate aftermath of Ed's arrest and the discovery of the horrors in his farmhouse, Plainfield was besieged by media. Reporters from across the country descended on the tiny town, interviewing anyone who would talk, taking photographs, turning the community's trauma into headlines and news stories. The attention was unwelcome and invasive. Plainfield residents were private, rural people who valued their quiet way of life. Suddenly, they were being asked to comment on the most disturbing crimes imaginable, to discuss a man many of them had known personally, to process their shock and horror in public. Some people talked to reporters, sharing their memories of Ed, expressing their disbelief that the harmless odd man they'd known could have done such things. Others refused to comment, wanting nothing to do with the media circus. But willing or not, Plainfield became famous, and that fame was entirely unwelcome. The Gein farmhouse, before it was burned, became a ghoulish tourist attraction. People drove from hundreds of miles away to see where the horrors had occurred, to take photographs, to gawk at the property where such terrible things had been discovered. Some people tried to take souvenirs of pieces of wood from the outbuildings, items from the debris pile. Anything they could claim came from Ed Gein's property. This macabre tourism disgusted the locals. These were their neighbors' bodies that had been violated, their community's tragedy being turned into entertainment. The decision to burn the farmhouse was partially motivated by a desire to end this tourism, to destroy the physical structure that was drawing such unwelcome attention. On March 20, 1958, the farmhouse was burned in what was officially described as a fire department training exercise, but what everyone understood was a deliberate destruction of a cursed place. Crowds gathered to watch it burn, and when the structure finally collapsed, many felt a sense of relief, as if destroying the building could somehow erase what had happened there. But the attention didn't end. Plainfield remained associated with Ed Gein in the national consciousness. When Psycho came out in 1960, based partly on Ed's crimes, Plainfield was mentioned in news articles discussing the film's origins. When the Texas Chain Saw Massacre was released in 1974, again, Plainfield was referenced. Each new book or documentary or film that touched on Ed Gein brought renewed attention to the small Wisconsin town. The people of Plainfield developed a complicated relationship with their town's dark history. Some wanted to forget, to never speak of it, to pretend it had never happened. Others recognized that forgetting was impossible, and that the best approach was to acknowledge the history while not dwelling on it. A few saw opportunities for dark tourism and actually welcomed the attention, though they were a minority. Over the decades, Plainfield has tried to move on. The town has changed, as all small rural towns have changed. Population has declined as younger people move to cities for opportunities. Farming has become more mechanized and less labor-intensive. The downtown has shrunk as businesses close and aren't replaced. But Ed Gein's shadow remains. Tourists still occasionally come to Plainfield, looking for locations associated with the case. The cemetery where Ed is buried gets visitors who want to see his grave, or where it used to be marked. The site where the hardware store stood, where Bernice Worden was killed, is noted on unofficial true crime tour maps. Some Plainfield residents resent this ongoing association with Ed Gein. They want their town to be known for something other than being home to a notorious killer and grave robber. They want visitors to appreciate Plainfield for its history, its agriculture, its community spirit, not for its connection to horror. Others have made a kind of peace with it. Ed Gein is part of Plainfield's history, as unwelcome as that fact may be. Denying it or trying to erase it won't work. Better to acknowledge it, learn from it, and contextualize it within the larger history of the community. The families most directly affected, the Wordens, the Hogans, the families of the grave robbery victims, had to carry the burden of trauma privately while their town dealt with public notoriety. Some stayed in the area, others left. Those who stayed had to live with constant reminders of what had happened, with the knowledge that their loved one's suffering had become entertainment for strangers. In recent years, there's been some discussion in Plainfield about whether to create any kind of official historical marker about the Ed Gein case. Some argue that pretending it didn't happen is dishonest, that history should be acknowledged. Others feel that creating a marker would only encourage more dark tourism, more exploitation of tragedy. As of now, there are no official markers in Plainfield commemorating or explaining Ed Gein's crimes. The town has chosen not to advertise its connection to these events. Those who want to learn about what happened can do so through books, documentaries, and online resources, but they won't find much acknowledgement in Plainfield itself. This choice reflects a broader question communities face when terrible events occur. How do you remember without glorifying? How do you acknowledge history without being defined by it? How do you honor victims while discouraging exploitation? Plainfield's approach has been to acknowledge when asked but not to volunteer, to allow the history to exist without promoting it, to let the outside world maintain its fascination, while the community itself focuses on moving forward. It's an imperfect solution, but perhaps there is no perfect solution when a small town becomes forever associated with crimes that shocked the world. Part 14. Final Aria Felicitationes. The case of Ed Gein forces us to confront some of the most disturbing questions about human nature, mental illness, and the capacity for evil. What Ed did, the grave robbing, the murders, the grotesque transformation of human remains into objects, represents a type of depravity that most people cannot comprehend. But in trying to understand Ed Gein, we must resist the temptation to simply label him a monster and move on. Monsters are comfortable categories. They're the other, the inhuman, the thing we can distance ourselves from. Ed Gein was not a monster in that sense. He was a human being, a man who was shaped by his experiences and his mental illness into someone capable of terrible things. His childhood under Augusta's domination was a form of psychological torture. She isolated him, controlled his thoughts, prevented him from developing any identity separate from her. She filled his head with ideas about sin and purity, and the evil of women that warped his understanding of sexuality, gender, and relationships. She made herself the center of his universe, and then died, leaving him alone and unable to function without her. None of this excuses what Ed did. Understanding is not excusing. The women whose graves he robbed deserve to rest in peace. Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan deserve to live full lives. The crimes Ed committed were evil, regardless of what led him to commit them. But recognizing the role that abuse and mental illness played in creating Ed Gein is important. It helps us understand that monsters are often made, not born. It highlights the importance of intervention when children are being abused, of mental health treatment for those who need it, of not allowing isolation and pathology to fester unchecked. If someone had intervened in Ed's childhood, if a teacher or neighbor had recognized the abuse and removed him from Augusta's control, if he'd been placed in a healthier environment where he could develop normally, would he have become the person he became? We can't know for certain, but it seems likely that Ed's trajectory could have been changed with proper intervention. This isn't to blame those who failed to intervene. In the 1920s and 30s, when Ed was growing up, awareness of child abuse was minimal, and intervention in family matters was rare. Religious fanaticism was often respected as personal belief rather than recognized as abusive when imposed on children. The tools and knowledge to help someone like Ed simply didn't exist in rural Wisconsin at that time. But today we have those tools. We have better understanding of child abuse, mental illness, and intervention strategies. We can recognize warning signs. We can provide treatment. We can potentially prevent the next Ed Gein from being created. The case also raises questions about how we treat the mentally ill, particularly the criminally mentally ill. Ed spent 26 years in psychiatric institutions, never receiving treatment that could cure him, because his condition was likely beyond cure, but being kept safe from society and society kept safe from him. Was this the right approach? Some argue that Ed should have been executed for his crimes, that his mental illness shouldn't have protected him from the ultimate punishment. Others feel that institutionalization was appropriate. Ed was genuinely ill, and punishing him criminally would have been pointless when he couldn't have been rehabilitated or deterred. There's no easy answer to this debate. But Ed's case demonstrates that our criminal justice system has to grapple with the reality that some people who commit terrible crimes are also severely mentally ill, and that simple categories of guilt and punishment don't always apply neatly. The cultural impact of Ed Gein's case is also worth reflecting on. His crimes inspired some of the most influential horror entertainment of the 20th century. Is this appropriate? Should we be turning real tragedy into fictional entertainment? There's an argument that horror fiction serves a valuable psychological function, allowing us to confront our fears in a controlled environment, to explore the dark side of human nature safely. If this is true, then perhaps the fictional works inspired by Ed Gein serve a purpose beyond simple entertainment. But we must also acknowledge that this entertainment is built on real suffering. Bernice Worden's son had to live knowing that his mother's murder became inspiration for horror movies. The families of grave robbery victims had to see their loved ones' desecration turned into plot points in fiction. The balance between educational artistic value and respect for victims is delicate and perhaps impossible to perfect. We can honor victims by remembering them as people, not just as crime statistics. We can approach true crime content with awareness that we're dealing with real tragedy. We can support victims' families and their right to privacy and dignity. But we cannot undo what Ed did, cannot bring back the dead, cannot erase the trauma he caused. All we can do is try to learn from his case, to understand what created him, to prevent similar cases in the future, and to remember the victims with respect. Conclusion. On a cold November day in 1957, police entered a farmhouse outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, and discovered horrors that would shock the world. Inside that house, they found the preserved remains of numerous women, fashioned into furniture, clothing, and decorations. They found evidence of grave robberies and murders that revealed the depths of human depravity and mental illness. The man responsible, Ed Gein, was a quiet bachelor known to his community as harmless and odd. But behind closed doors, he lived in a world of death and delusion, trying desperately to bring back his domineering mother by wearing the skin of dead women. Ed Gein killed at least 2 women, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, and robbed the graves of at least 15 others. He lived with human remains for years, treating them as raw materials for his grotesque projects. And when he was finally caught, he spent the rest of his life in mental institutions, never fully understanding or acknowledging the evil of what he'd done. The victims of Ed Gein's crimes deserve to be remembered. Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old hardware store owner shot in her own business and butchered like an animal. Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner who disappeared and whose fate remained unknown for 3 years. The women whose graves were robbed, whose final rest was violated, whose remains were desecrated in ways almost too terrible to describe. These women were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. They were valued members of their communities. They deserved better than the fate Ed Gein inflicted upon them. Their families deserved not to have their grief compounded by such grotesque violations. The case of Ed Gein teaches us dark lessons about what humans are capable of when abuse, isolation, and mental illness combine. It shows us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearances. It demonstrates the importance of intervention when children are being abused and of treatment when mental illness is identified. It also shows us the lasting impact that such crimes have on communities. Plainfield, Wisconsin, will forever be associated with Ed Gein, no matter how much the town might wish otherwise. The trauma of what happened there in 1957 ripples forward through generations, a wound that never fully heals. Ed Gein died in 1984, taking many secrets with him to his grave. We'll never know the full extent of his crimes, never fully understand the workings of his disturbed mind, never completely answer all the questions his case raises. but we can remember the victims. We can honor their lives and their memories. We can learn from this tragedy